Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of our program, Jones and Company. On this program every weekend we discuss the national issues of the Bahamas, and we are happy that you are able to join us. There are a whole lot of issues in the news, and if you listen to radio or read newspapers, you would see the government is moving ahead on something in Grand Bahama, a cruise port, and then on the negative side, they're talking about issues of corruption. There is also the issue of fiscal responsibility, among other things. And then, of course, in foreign affairs, the government has taken a certain position on Venezuela. All of these issues we want to talk about today. And our guest on the program is the Honorable Fred Mitchell, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration. He's now the chairman of the Progressive Liberal Party. It's a pleasure to have him as our guest today. Mr. Mitchell, welcome.
Yeah, it's been a while. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. Good to see you both.
Godfrey, nice to see you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mitchell, you know, we read many press statements coming from you almost on a weekly basis. You've been very active, haven't you?
Every day.
Yeah.
I pledged when I took this job to answer everything. So we try and scour the papers every day and the press and answer so that people know what the PLP's position is on any specific thing at any time. And there's a page on Facebook you can go to and check if you want to know what the PLP believes on a particular issue.
So you're generally improving the public relations of the party?
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet because, of course, we don't have the kind of salubrious atmosphere for PLP statements at the moment. There appears to me an attempt to suppress the PLP's opinions in public by the mainstream media. So we're fighting that hostility. And but you know, by and large, I think that after a year and a half or so, people in the party are finally getting their sea legs back, and you know, are starting to stand up again and have confidence that we can actually do this.
The statements, though, are just coming from yourself and the leader of the party. We don't hear too many others. Well, Gunnar Martin from time to time.
Right. Well, there's a functioning shadow cabinet, and I think the last statement, Mike Darville, for example, just did a statement as the spokesman on education, right, with regard to what happened at C.W. Sawyer, and so we got the press after that. But of course, apart from your paper, I don't think anyone paid much attention to it, except that in the Guardian story was buried deep down in it. So obviously they used it as the jumping off point, but you know, the PLP doesn't get the credit for it. So, as I say, there's that. And, of course, I think the shadow cabinet, the younger ones are in particular learning the art of being in a shadow cabinet. I was really pleased that Jo Beth Colby Davis, for example, is more active in trying to explain across the country what happened in this recent Frank Smith case. Mm-hmm. And she will be going along with Damian Gomez around the country and on radio and television trying to explain how we see things.
Mm-hmm. If there's one issue that really caused you to be upset in the last week or two, what is it?
Boy, there's so many. One of them, of course, is people taking credit for things that don't belong to them. I mean, this thing about the port in Grand Bahama. I mean, they've not served Grand Bahama well, and went up there with this big fanfare after the disaster of Oman, and now they have this big fanfare about a cruise port. And of course, the cruise port is not their idea, and they'd actually gone to sleep on the whole thing. But now they understand. The facts are that when you reach year 2, you're in trouble, because in a 5-year term, you know, it takes 3 years from the time you plan and lay out something to the first shovel in the ground. And, you know, 3 years is up, really. So they had to desperately run up there and trot this project out. And of course, it's something which, again, they got from the drawing board. And then you add that, of course, to the Frank Smith case, which is just egregious, the conduct of the public officials in that matter.
Mm-hmm. Godfrey?
There's another element, Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Trump appeals to his base by talking about this wall. All right?
Yeah.
The FNM appeals to his base by talking about corruption. What is the PLP going to do about that stigma?
Well, I don't accept it's a stigma. That's the first thing. I don't accept people's propaganda about myself. And this is why I was referring earlier to this question of people getting their sea legs back, because I think part of the success of the FNM in the last general election was they got PLPs to believe this stuff about themselves. And there's a simple principle that I try and tell people. Anytime you hear this stuff being said by them, there's a principle in law, and it applies across the board. Hear the other side. Before you make up your mind, hear the other side. I mean, one of the examples that, of course, stands out is Philip Brave Davis is accused of giving a contract to his brother. And it turns out it's absolutely false. As soon as he learned that they intended to do that, the whole thing was canceled. But you have these alarming headlines, and then I look at the chat feedback from PLPs. Oh my, oh this and that. And everybody's saying, hang on, to find out the truth. They find out the truth. Oh, I see. So that's one of the issues, is trying to get people to understand that if you buy into that, you're actually defeating yourself. Now, so you can go back and check the objective facts with regard to this. And certainly the case of Frank Smith and the findings of the magistrate in the Frank Smith against the Commissioner of Police case, which just happened, show they show that if you look objectively at things, it is not what it seems.
Wait, Mr. Mitchell, you know Goebbels. Goebbels' whole philosophy, if you say it enough, people believe it.
Right, and that's why I say it back. As soon as, that's why I say to Mr. Jones, as soon as you say something, I answer it immediately. But the underlying problem is, or was, because I think people have got their sea legs back now, the underlying problem is people's lack of confidence in themselves. I mean, during the whole time we were in government, I used to say this. They'd always say, well, why isn't the government saying this, or why isn't the government saying this? But you know, we're the PLPs. We're the PLPs that write the letters to the newspaper. We're the PLPs who respond. It's not just the government, and it's not just the leaders. So that's something that you know, we have to work on. And I find that our opposite numbers are more confident in the things they're saying, even though the things are not objectively proven to be true.
Yeah. On the Frank Smith matter, are you surprised that the government appealed?
No, I'm not surprised, because I thought that they were embarrassed by the result. And I thought it was an attempt by them to put a gag on the public discussion of the matter. But you know, anybody who reads these things will know that on appeal, they're simply looking at the record. So the record is what it is, and you can discuss what is the record. And I wanted to get that out very quickly. That, you know, I think that the press here and you know, the government always appeals to these technical rules about sub judice and all this other rubbish. But the fact is, on appeal, there are different sets of considerations having to do with the discussion of public matters, and the judge made the findings. They're in the public domain, and so they're free to be discussed.
Damian Gomez says that the criminal justice system in the country has been corrupted. You and others have made calls for the resignation of 2 cabinet ministers. Damian Gomez says the Attorney General should resign as well. Are you satisfied that the system will not be respected until they do resign?
Let me put it this way. During the course of the trial, we knew what was going to come out in the evidence. Just take the phone logs. The phone logs were used to try and show that this lady was calling Frank Smith. When he compared it to the bills that he got, it turns out quite the opposite. 90% of the calls were she was calling him, not Frank Smith calling her. That was part of their case. The lady comes into the stand, she says, I don't want to be here. She indicates that she's being brought under pressure to come there. And then it turns out that she met with 2 ministers of the government. And then the issue of the contract. You have the Minister of Health, who approves, without the board's authority, goes over the board, approves a contract of quite a good contract for the person who's going to end up being the star witness for the government as part of their propaganda effort on this corruption narrative that they spin. So there were problems that we saw. When someone is a minister of justice, as a prosecutor is. You look at the bar code, and it says how a prosecutor is supposed to act. So the attorney general is the prosecutor. And so he is supposed to be a minister of justice. And that minister of justice is not trying to get a conviction. What he's trying to do is to administer justice, to be sure that there is a just result. So in our view, he ought to have seen, or his team ought to have seen, that this case was plainly hopeless. I mean, Bartimus could have seen it was hopeless. And so therefore you have a responsibility not to take it to the trier of fact, but stop the case. Say, sorry, I withdraw this from the trier of fact, because it simply does not hang together. That was not done. And so I think that's an egregious fault. And then, of course, knowing what the evidence was with regard to the other two ministers. But you know, the kind of atmosphere we live in today, it appears, because you have 35-4, you just do whatever you want. And the whole social construct on which, and conventions on which we build our society just seem to have gone out the window. And that's why I think Damian Gomez is correct with regard to the damage done to the administration of justice.
Do you think democracy is in trouble?
If you look at the formal institutions, you would say so. But I think there is a very dynamic atmosphere which is going on in the substrata.
But Mr. Mitchell, you got people in the parliament who do not understand the system under which we are governed.
Well, yes, and I mean we could.
So it's not only it is throughout the society, sir.
That's so, but you know, democracy requires public participation. And I'm saying what helps in this atmosphere today is the discussion that's going on in the substrata, the social media, outside the formal mechanisms. Now, if you take the formal mechanisms, I was quite surprised when the member for Centerville decided that the House of Assembly is useless, or some such expression he used.
On the Public Accounts Committee matter?
Right. He resigned and said he found that the House of Assembly is useless. And I said to my colleagues, I said, you know, well, I was talking to the University of the Bahamas crowd. Sometimes I have lunch there on Thursdays. And so I said to them, if you do the math, the number of people who get into the House of Assembly, only 39 people can get there at a time. If the population, so it's about 0.0975% of the population can get into the House of Assembly. This gentleman tried 3 times to get into the House, got in on the 3rd try. And on the 3rd try, 18 months into the term, he decides the House of Assembly is useless. The House of Assembly is not useless. You know, Shakespeare says the fault is not in the stars, but in ourselves that we're underlings. You know, you just have to look at what individual members of Parliament did when they were outside the governing structures. That's what the House of Assembly is for. So that's why I'm saying the substrata is dynamic. We are trying to, as a party, we have a module coming up on the 7th to the 9th of March for people who are aspirant candidates. And we are trying to rectify that issue, that you don't have a situation where you have a member of Parliament who's parliamentary secretary. The Prime Minister gets up and says, if you vote against this, you're gone. And you say it's your conscience. And so you give a long speech, my conscience, I'm voting for my constituents. You do that, and the Prime Minister says, you're gone. And then the next day you're crying in the newspaper, I didn't know that that was going to be like that. Yeah. So it's an embarrassment.
You see, another factor, Mr. Mitchell, is that President Obama, and Jones and I talk about all the time, was in Ghana, gave a speech, and he said democracy is more than what happens when you vote. Democracy is what happens between elections.
Yeah, it requires, you know, that's what I'm saying. I'm pleased at the level of public participation.
See, but I'm not, because I listened to his show and I participated in one of his shows, right? And I told the director of education last week, one of the deficiencies in our educational system, there's no civics.
Well, they do have...
People really do not understand what democracy is, Mr. Mitchell.
Well, I agree. I mean, I found some interesting things out, but about how people focus on what's actually going on in the country, and this is part of the job of an opposition party, is to try and shape public opinion the way we wish it. I was, I just had this accident, and so I was in the hospital yesterday in the morning, and so one of the treating attendants came in and was talking to me, and he said, "Oh, I thought I recognized your face." And I said, "Yeah." He says, "So what are you doing these days?" Was the question. He says, "Are you out of politics?" I said, "No, I'm the chairman of the party, and I'm in the Senate."
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, well, politics is really quiet nowadays. Not much is happening, right?" I said, "I suppose you could say that." But, it's, and I'm saying that, not it's a kind of funny story in a way. But, some consultants told me in my campaign maybe 10 years or so ago that you can't assume that the general public is actually clued into what is going on with all of this stuff.
Mr. Mitchell,
Yeah.
I was at a funeral today.
Right.
I was sitting in the same bench with a lady. She looked behind her and she asked a gentleman, "What is his name?" Meaning me.
Yes, right.
All right? So the gentleman said, "That's Wendell Jones." She said, "Oh, I heard about him." And then he pointed to Jeff Lloyd across the way. And he said, "Who is that gentleman over there?" This is what the fella asked the lady. He said, "His face looks familiar."
Yeah.
Jeff Lloyd, the Minister of
Yeah,
Education.
yeah. So but in Fox Hill, there was a big opening of this community center, millions of dollars spent, brand new swimming pool. On my Facebook page, 64,000 views when the pool was unveiled. So I went to meet with a family and to have a discussion. And one of the questions they asked me is, "What have I done for Fox Hill?" So I said, was kind of nonplussed by the question. So I said, "Well, for starters, let's say, how about the community center that was built?" And they said, "What community center?" And the community center is less than a mile away from where they live. What community center? So I'm saying I don't know what's going on, but there's a dynamic which is working. And one of the other things we tried to tell our younger ones is that do not assume that because you create excitement on Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram and all these other social media platforms, because these media platforms are captives to the people who join them and who have internet services. They do not mean the country, they may not mean the country at large. And that's, the country at large is what we're interested in.
The point is the Progressive Liberal Party reconnecting? Is there a disconnect, huge disconnect between what you are doing and young Bahamians?
I don't think so. I think that the younger ones in particular have started working on the branch structure. I think what's got our base excited at the moment, and excited is a double-edged sword, of course, is that we are inviting people who want to run for office to begin the process of applications, and the choices are going to be made on the first or initial recommendations at the branch level.
Yeah, but fine. But are you connecting? You lost miserably. It was an abysmal performance of the Progressive Liberal Party in the last general election. Do you think you are gaining any ground at all?
Well, again, I don't adopt that language. I think the population was manipulated in a way, that caused the result. The base of the PLP is there, was eroded, I agree. And we're just building back from that time. And I think when you look at the stats, it's shifting back in the PLP's direction.
The people were manipulated. So then the Progressive Liberal Party, you were not communicating your message effectively.
Well, I'm not sure. You know, I just looked at, and you know, the result is what it is, and I try not to litigate the past because it's done, right? My view is, you know, I can't do anything about the past anyway, but I move forward. But I was looking at Al Jazeera at a very detailed documentary on how British public opinion was manipulated on the Brexit result. And it clearly was not based on facts or objective reality. And it was a disastrous decision for their country.
And you think the same thing applied here?
I think when you look and see what happened in the last election, you'll see that that was quite something that influenced the result here. Mm-hmm. Having said that, there are real issues which have to be addressed. And I think that even though this period is not sexy for many people, because I think many people think that we ought to mass mobilize and rush out into the streets and sweep the government out of office, I think that there is a reconstruction period that has to be done, which has to be done under the radar. And that's what's happening now, step by step, to reconnect.
Mr. Mitchell, there are new realities in the 21st century, all right? And we say on our programs that there's a segment of the Bahamian population which have been marginalized due to their various reasons, lack of education, social status, where you live, right? But that element of our society is growing. And it's reflected, sir, in the increase of poverty in our country. Right? We have a poverty problem here.
Well, there's no question. I mean,
but see, what concerns me, I don't hear anybody from either side speaking to that issue.
Well, we speak to the issue. You know, you can go back to statements and so on and so forth. I mean, I must have 3 or 4 speaking engagements per week, which are all, you know, multiplied across all our platforms. But one statistic that I commonly recite is a statistic from the Central Bank of the Bahamas, which was published last year. And they said 50% of the people in the country who make under $30,000 a year can't make ends meet at the end of the month. And they were asked, how do you make it? And they said, we borrow from our family, we borrow from our friends, and we sell things on the side, or we sell property, that, you know, little things that we have. And I'm not a member of Parliament, but I can tell you that I set up over social services, and I see the lines, and I can count during the course of the day 13, 14, 15 mature men who are sitting around the center of the Foxhole Park with absolutely nothing to do during the course of the day. And I know of at least half a dozen men now, young men, who are in their middle 20s to low 30s, who, for one reason or another, simply cannot find a job. Just can't find a job. You go to the Department of Labor, they put in resume after resume after resume, and there's just nothing.
And they discourage workers?
Discouraged, despair, whatever.
But the Minister of Labor said that, according to ILO, that doesn't impact the unemployment.
Well, yes, of course, that's in the definition. You have to be looking for work. So, you know what they say, it's lies, damn lies, and statistics. You know, you could, anything you want to support, you just find a statistic to do.
But that's not the reality.
No, it isn't the reality. And I mean, that's why we were so harsh in our response to the Prime Minister's comment boasting about unemployment statistics going down in Grand Bahama. And we said, well, where does this fellow actually live? Because all you need to do is go down to the dock on a Friday and see people loading up their possessions, putting them on the dock, because they're all moving to Nassau, 4, 5, 6 families at a time.
Let's take a break here. We're going to look at some of the issues in a particular kind of order with Mr. Fred Mitchell. We take this break, we'll come right back. We're back here on Jones and Company, and Senator Mitchell is our guest on the program today. Senator, the situation in Venezuela is breaking the hearts of millions of people. Millions have moved out of Venezuela. People aren't able to get food and medical attention. And there are many governments in the Western Hemisphere that have decided not to support the current president, Maduro. The Bahamas took a particular position at the OAS, and then I saw a release from the Prime Minister's office saying that, you know, our policy of non-intervention remains the same.
Yeah, we really chuckled at that one.
Yeah.
Because when I was foreign minister, I met in place a policy that essentially said you stayed out of the internal affairs of a country. And of course one is concerned about the human rights of people, about the ability to get food, about the economy of Venezuela, about oppression and all the rest of it. But we have diplomatic relations with the Maduro government. We haven't broken diplomatic relations with them. We saw that an election result took place. So de facto, he's the person in charge. Some states took it upon themselves to reach into Venezuela and say, we're no longer going to support that person. We're going to support the leader of the opposition. So take the equivalent position. That would be like Mr. Davis getting up tomorrow and saying, I am now the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, and you should recognize me. And other states says, yeah, we agree with that, and we're going to do that. Well, everybody here would think that that's a wrong result because it doesn't actually reflect the institutional position. So the position has always been the governments of the Bahamas to refrain from getting involved in these matters, the internal affairs of the country. So when it wasn't a vote, but when the decision was taken to express the view that the opposition should be supported in contradistinction to the government, we said, hang on a second here. Can you explain? I mean, you may have cogent reasons for doing so, but can you explain to us why the Bahamas government is taking the position? And particularly since the back chat was obvious that the public officials in the ministry had advised against it. So fast forward to the last statement. I got from one of my Caribbean colleagues a copy of a letter which was written by the Prime Minister to the Secretary General. And one paragraph in the letter just stood out to me. The Bahamas' position is non-interference in the affairs of other countries and a whole lot of other things in the list. So again, we had to say, well, what's going on here? On the one hand, you say you're going to reach into the country and you're going to support the leader of the opposition. And now you say you support this conference of neutral parties in Uruguay that's going to take place in Uruguay. And you are going to support the principle of non-interference. It just comes off as a bit
Are you clear on what the government's position is?
Well, the letter is written by the Prime Minister, so I'm assuming that the Prime Minister speaks for the government, and it comes off, I say, as a repudiation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs position. How that can happen, I don't know, because it would have been impossible for that to happen under the administration of Perry Christie. It couldn't happen because the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs spoke as one. So. And
so you are suggesting that the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister are not speaking as one.
Well,
but you would take the position of the Prime Minister.
Well, he speaks for the country. He speaks for the country, not the Foreign Minister. When the Foreign Minister speaks, unless he's superseded by the Prime Minister. Now they might want to have their cake and eat it too, because there's a similar issue in Jamaica. Jamaica also signed on to this non-interference, but they also say, our colleagues in the opposition in the Caribbean, they're equally as confused as to where everyone is. What we suspect happened, of course, is that there was pressure put on them by the United States to vote in a particular direction, and our foreign policy today is whatever the U.S. says.
So our policy right now is confused on Venezuela.
I think so, and on a whole number of other fronts. But that one just sticks out like a sore thumb.
Mr. Mitchell, I know you're probably cognizant of it. What has been the impact of, for example, Venezuela on Trinidad?
Trinidad has a very curious relationship with Venezuela. as does Guyana. The issue of the territorial
Yes, yeah.
issues and the question of who owns what under the sea. But Rowley, Prime Minister Rowley, has been very strong on this point. He, in fact, built and led the consensus in CARICOM that we will not interfere in the internal affairs of Venezuela. Trinidad is one of the progenitors of the conference, which is supposed to be held in Uruguay. But I see where the Americans announced yesterday, they brought this man, Elliot Abrams, in from one of the old regimes, who is quite a right-wing fellow. And he has said that the time for talking to Maduro is done, unless it is talking about how he's going to leave Venezuela. I mean, this is sort of extraordinary talk. The man is a citizen of Venezuela. So when we were looking at this, I was saying to colleagues that, it looks to me like Aristide revisited. We sat through that whole era when essentially the American government told us, Aristide is going. We're not going to extend the protection that we did before. We'll find a safe place for him to go, and that's it. So it looks like the fix is in. I mean, the Bank of England, for example, which is supposed to be a place where it's safe to put your reserves, when the government of Venezuela tried to transfer the gold reserves, I think some $8 billion from the Bank of England, they refused to carry out the instructions, saying that they didn't recognize Maduro, they recognized the leader of the opposition. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. So it just looks as if there's a new sort of tightening, and we'll see what happens here.
How do you read the China connection to this?
Well, the Chinese have always said, non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, except that China does not have the reach that the United States has.
Yes, in this region, right, in this hemisphere,
and neither does Russia.
Yeah.
So it's good for them to, I suppose, take a moral position. But what I think is very curious is just before John Kerry left office as Secretary of State, he gave a speech to the Organization of American States. And he essentially pronounced the Monroe Doctrine as dead.
Yeah. As dead?
As dead, yeah. He said, look, the era of us interfering in countries, that's done. And we want to work going forward. We want to work with countries going forward. Well, clearly, that is out the window. And the whole issue that many countries, of course, are asking themselves, particularly after you see what happened in Syria, is whether or not you have a reliable ally. Can you depend on the United States as a reliable ally?
What is, because we seem to be a country who is xenophobic, myopic, what do you see the role of international affairs in the public policy of the Bahamas?
Well, the two are twinned together. Our investments, climate and trade policy, and foreign policy are twinned together. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, quite apart from its ability to smooth the passage of Bahamians traveling around the world, because remember, that was my mantra. My mantra was I wanted that passport, that Bahamian passport, to be able to get Bahamians everywhere around the world without visa restrictions and requirements.
Still can't go to Australia.
Yes, I understand. But that was my. So that's point number one. Point number two, though, is to support trade. Now, we were engaged in an outreach to the United Arab Emirates and to Qatar during our time. I think Qatar has sort of gone dead. UAE, they're still moving toward the Expo 2020. But one of the things that these countries require for investment in our country is a couple of things: the double taxation treaty and an investment protection treaty. And we have been very slow to get these things done. And investment protection is really a treaty which says that you're not going to expropriate their property if they invested here. I mean, people have come here, they've been very impressed by it, so on and so forth. So that is, in my view, the role of foreign policy and international trade is to make this an atmosphere where people want to invest and they know that it is a safe place to invest. I mean, the country has a good reputation as it is, but there are certain technical things which have to be put in place.
Talking about trade, some people are talking about WTO.
The favorite letters in the alphabet.
Yeah, some people are not. Some people just simply do not understand it.
Yeah.
And the Progressive Liberal Party has a position on it.
Right.
And what is that position?
That position is, at this point, the government should pause and get more consultations on the views of the Bahamian public before they advance, particularly given the fact that the U.S. is in a position where it appears to want to withdraw from it. So you know what direction it's going to take.
So you want a public that doesn't understand WTO to give the government a position on it?
Well, no, I'm saying that we described it as taking the temperature of the public.
Yeah, but the public can't give you a temperature because the average Bahamian is a little confused about it, more than a little confused. They are oblivious to what you're even seeking to do with WTO.
Well, there are 4 points that we raised. We said it's the government's responsibility to do the public education, not the PLP's responsibility. Yeah. And we've done what we did, which was it was taken up, an offer was given. The offer was never prosecuted. So we're looking, and what we said is, until the government actually settles what the offer is, there's nothing for us to say. Nothing for us to say. And, if you want to reduce WTO down to its essence, of course, WTO is simply a customs agreement, which is to lower customs duties. And then the question is, how do you make up the revenue from the loss of customs duties? The fact is, of course, that the country is already WTO compliant in so many ways.
Wouldn't you say that it's simply not in the interests of the Bahamas at this time to join the WTO as a full member?
Well, that's not for me to say. I say when the government makes an offer, we'll tell you what the position is.
All right.
The party's position is what it is.
On Haiti, Mr. Mitchell, we've seen the number of people who perished in the shipwreck the other day. They're still finding bodies. The Haitian government and the Bahamian government apparently have not been able to come together to deal and to come up with ways and means to decrease this migration out of Haiti.
It's perplexing to all of us, to all citizens, and certainly perplexing to us, how you can get all the way up to Abaco without being spotted.
Yes.
How you can even get all the way into almost to the mouth of the base here in New Providence and not get stopped by these boats. And we keep hearing these reports that 5 out of the 9 boats that we just bought are not working, they're not functional. That the logistical expertise and capabilities of the Defense Force are not what they ought to be. You don't want to sort of beat a drum beat on that too much because you don't want to be saying negative things about the Defense Force, but it perplexes the public. And the thing is, there's human lives being lost as a result of it. I don't think that the Haitian government has the capacity to do anything to stop it. I think we have better and greater capacity, but I don't think the capacity is being utilized. And of course, foreign affairs has been downgraded to such an extent in this administration that you actually don't know what they're doing from day to day and whether or not they have any impact at all on the situation.
How has it been downgraded, foreign affairs?
Well, you just have to have someone do an examination of the journal files and see how many times you've heard from the foreign minister in the last year, and that should tell you something. Silence must be golden.
But Mr. Mitchell, isn't that the job of the opposition to do that?
Do what?
Make the public aware when ministries are ineffective.
Well,
departments are ineffective.
That's what we do. No question. Yeah, no question. But
what you're saying here today about the Defense Force is mind-boggling. We not aware of these things.
No, well, I can show you the statements. This is what I'm saying. I get the impression. It's like the Secretary General just responded to something that was in the newspaper about the same situation about Venezuela. Mm-hmm. I thought it was quite a thoughtful letter about the government's position on Venezuela. In the middle of the letter, there's some gratuitous insult hurled at me about something which has nothing to do with this letter this fellow wants to write about Venezuela. So you get the impression that these little traps in the mainstream media that's just left there, and as long as PLP is associated with it, the idea is to suppress the opinions. So we track, for example, our statements to see whether they actually make it into the public domain. And I would say the yield, take your newspaper apart, the yield is less than 50%. So that's why we're trying to develop our own sort of distribution system. And this will turn around, I believe, as we get closer to the election, because then the base gets more fired up. But you can't say, and I said it at the start, you can't say there is anything that this government does that goes without an answer from us.
But Mr. Mitchell, I don't see why this is a surprise, because the Bahamian press has never been filled with the PLP.
No, I wasn't saying it was a surprise. I wasn't saying it was a surprise. But what I say to people is that it goes back to what I was saying earlier about this stuff in the British and Brexit, is do not assume that the information that you get comes from a neutral platform. Otherwise, you're starting from a false premise. You just, what did they say the other day, a Guardian editorial. In the editorial, it says, Marvin Dames is the most qualified Minister of National Security ever. The managing editor of The Guardian is his sister. And the editorial of the newspaper is saying, without shame, without shame. You think these people would have some shame, but they don't.
At the end of the day, it's about the economy, Mr. Mitchell. Are people happy? The government states that they see some strengthening in the economy. The central bank governor said that, by the way. And with this initiative in Grand Bahama, we see certain things happening in Exuma. Is the economy improving as far as you see?
I go back to lies, damn lies, and statistics. You can get statistics from the IMF. It says 2% growth or 3% growth. You can talk about cutting back on deficits, and of course we know that's a false narrative because the deficit was on the way down. The only issue was, of course, the 2 hurricanes. So these folk, all they're boasting about right now about how the deficit is going down, et cetera, et cetera. One hurricane could throw that completely out. So that's fine. Those numbers are fine and all the rest of it, and those numbers are what they are. But what is the factor on the ground? Can the lady feed her children at the end of the week? That's what we're concerned about. Are our kids getting in the education system the fairest break they can? One of the concerns I have, for example, the school that in Fox Hill, the Doris Johnson Senior School, the kids just did very well. The boys basketball team just won the government league for the secondary schools. And so as a result of it, I've gotten to talk to coaches from all of the schools about the support which the government gives in the area of sports. And I'm really keen on this because after Buddy Hield became the great success that he is in basketball, almost every kid in Doris Johnson wanted to be Buddy Hield. Now, that's a good track to be on because you finish high school, you go into university. Basketball provides you with the support for that. Now I'm told that the Nationals, for example, which go to Grand Bahama every year and are supported by the government, there's a question about whether resources are going to be provided by the government this year to support the Nationals. Yeah. But that's nonsense. This is a time when all the coaches from overseas come and watch the kids play basketball in Grand Bahama. That's the feeder program for scholarships, for these kids to get an education. And this country can't survive, education, education, education. So in terms of the policy things we're developing from the PLP side, we're saying, we have to be able to do better than that. I mean, Doris Johnson, for example, the kids have to go to various basketball games. They need a bus. For $2,500 to fix a bus They couldn't find the resources to get $2,500 to fix a bus so that they could take the kids to the basketball games.
The Minister of Finance says that he wants to balance the budget, Mr. Mitchell, and reduce the deficit. I believe that they're cutting back in many ways. You get that?
Yeah, I understand, but you know, you can't, it's clear now that you can't put a bean counter to be a Minister of Finance, because he doesn't get it. You cannot put a bean counter to be a Minister of Finance, because this country, a developing country, cannot develop unless you borrow. It's impossible. It's crazy. It's like, one day I was watching Oprah Winfrey on television, and she's saying, you mustn't max out your credit card. Here's a woman worth $2 billion telling you don't max out your credit card. But I know of a woman who lives in Roll Avenue. She maxes out everything because that's the only way she can make it at the end of the month. So there's a different reality for people. You know, so that's the story there. So you have to have a feel for people.
Yeah. So this fiscal responsibility bill.
That bill is nonsense. It's rubbish. It isn't worth the paper it's written on. It is complete and utter rubbish. Because if you look at the provisions of it, at any point they can opt out of it. You know, some fancy expression they use like exigencies or so on and so forth, but it does not mean or amount to a hill of beans. What you get is some people who just got out of school with their PhDs from university, you know, go into the IMF for the first 3 years, come down here, prescribe formulae to the Bahamas and these smaller countries about what they must do and what they mustn't do, inflicting pain on these societies. And we go and follow those prescriptions. It's lunacy.
The people in Belize say they weren't going to follow the IMF.
Well, you know, I think that that's probably the right thing to do.
So the PLP's position then is that if you are re-elected, you would put aside the Fiscal Responsibility Act?
I can't say what we'd specifically do, but I tell you what our approach is. Our approach is, when Perry Christie was the Prime Minister, IMF came and said, you have to raise taxes. And he said, no, I'm not going to raise taxes. I'm not going to do it. Because I'm not going to inflict any more taxes on the Bahamian public. I'm simply not going to do it. I am going to deal with deficit, and I'm going to deal with expansion by simply growing this economy. Now, unfortunately, I mean, you know, others are suing now the big project that, you know, they fought against and said it was a mirage and it was a bad deal and so on and so forth. Now they're crowing to the rafters, talking about the Bahama project here in New Providence. Now they're crowing to the rafters about how successful it is and how great it is and so on and so forth. But right now, if you ask me, there's a list of things that the Bahamas ought to be doing in terms of its investment in infrastructure, in terms of investment in small business. My view is that you know, $250 million or so should be set aside for venture capital from the government. My view is the Nassau airport needs to be expanded again because it is too small for what it does. My view is those airports in the Family Islands must be completed. It's ridiculous when you see what happens in North Eleuthera during when New Year's comes. My view is, or Exuma, and my view is the platform, the digital platform on which we're operating is falling apart. Telephone calls are dropping. No one's looking at telecommunications and data in this country. It's time now to move to 5G. There's no talk about investment in that and what's going to happen in the future. All of these things will make this country competitive and grow in the future.
Mr. Mitchell.
But instead, they're still trying to litigate the 2017 election and this stupid narrative they have about corruption. And in fact, the only person who's been convicted of corruption in this country in the last 10 years is an F&M partisan.
Mr. Mitchell, on the way forward for our country, we need to, and I hear very few people talking about it. Our country is underpopulated.
Yeah.
And the poorest part of our country is the area or the region that is posing the greatest security risk. That's the southeastern Bahamas, which is being depopulated.
Yes, it's really sad. I mean, one of the things we talk about is Ragged Island. I mean, because, you know, the population was affected by the storm. There were promises to refurbish it. It's not been done. And then, of course, Ackland's Crooked Island.
He'd been down to Ackland's, Salina Point area, and it's an ideal location for a deep water port.
Right. I think Mr. Christie had gone down there and suggested that ought to be done. And then of course you have these people who are promoting something now in Mayaguana. But I get the impression that this is just a project to dig aggregate out of the ground and being dressed up in something, So you just, after the Oban experience, you don't know whether you can actually trust these people with anything that they say. It just doesn't seem to be real. It doesn't seem to, sort of nothing you can touch and feel. There's just a story being spun all the time.
Should the government move ahead with Oban?
No, they should not. Our position is that project should be abandoned. It's not a fit and proper project for the Bahamas.
It's not a fit and proper project?
No. All sorts of issues. I mean, it starts with a false premise because they couldn't figure out who the principals of the darn thing are. Now they say they're doing their due diligence after the fact. So that's not a fit and proper process. What is necessary, though, is Grand Bahama does need a project. And so we're watching very carefully the development of this port.
Yeah.
Now, what our concern is immediately is why is the port inside the port area and not outside the port area? Because inside the port area, you have two governments operating. Yeah. You have two levels of decision making.
The PLP was putting it at the eastern end.
Outside the port, right outside the port.
And the F&M's position is to bring it into the port.
Right, at Barbary Beach. And,
yes.
and if you look at the history of this project, because we always watch to see whether or not you're going to get the proper credit for things that you do. Obviously, you're the government now, so you complete it. So it's very clever. Prime Minister gets up and says, this project spanned 3 administrations. So no one can now say that he didn't give the PLP credit because it did span 3 administrations. But that's sort of damning you with faint praise, right? So the story is, of course, that you'll remember that former Prime Minister Ingram allowed Hutchison to have a veto over whether another port could go in Grand Bahama. And he started out wanting to put the port in Williamstown, but couldn't get Hutchison to agree to waive their rights. So that was abandoned. Perry Christie came along and was able to get Hutchison to waive the right of veto to allow the port to go in East Grand Bahama. And now you have this crew that's moving it, and they're going to put it in Barbary Beach. So that's the context around which, but what was supposed to have been central to the project is the Bahamianization or the Bahamianizing aspect of it, so that Carnival is at the core, but everything else is Bahamian, from water sports to souvenirs. You just go down the list. This was supposed to be projects.
But I got to ask this question. I was under the impression that this thing was going to be in the east end of Grand Bahama.
The east end would be down by McLeanstown, High Rock.
Right,
yes.
and then you will have a spill-off in the northern Abaco.
No, that's all changed.
In the northern Abaco, and I thought that was,
changed.
It's all changed. That's going to be. It's now in the Barbary Beach area, which is inside the port area. That's where it's going to go.
Mr. Mitchell.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so very much.
Great.
We went over time, but we had to get certain questions in. Thank you so very much.
Great pleasure. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Godfrey.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching and listening to our program today, and we hope to get Mr. Mitchell back sometime soon.
Pleasure.
Good evening, everyone.